The backdrop is Houston, Texas, May of 2021. The main event is Charles Oliveira vs. Michael Chandler. The co-main event is Tony Ferguson vs. Beneil Dariush. We're a few days before the fights. At the press conference, you know, typical stuff. There's a zinger there and a zinger there. And something happens that most MMA fans remember fondly between these two future opponents.
Could not have scripted it any better. It's perfect.
Thanks. You dodged me too, Chandler.
Hey, that's not true. Hey,
every person out here except for this guy right here that's sitting next to me.
Hey, that's not true.
I'm going to be real, man.
Tony.
The other side, those are
hey, you could have
We're
fought
coming
me
over here
January
this side's
23rd.
victory table.
You could have fought me January 23rd and I would have done the same thing to you.
Hey, man, you said no, man. I'm going to be real. You got this shit handed to you. You got Dana White privilege.
Tony. Thanks, Dana.
It's all love, baby.
Goodness.
Everybody laughs, even the guy who's being made fun of, UFC President Dana White. Now, interesting thing is, this actually isn't the first time that Dana's name and his race and class have been linked together. Check this clip out right here.
75K was the bonuses for tonight. Why? Why the bump?
Tony Ferguson, Dana White privilege.
That was a pretty good line.
That was fucking incredible. Incredible. It's one of the best I've ever heard.
Had you heard that one before?
No, I never. No. Rampage used to call me Dana. It's good to be white. That's the second best one.
Fast forward to UFC 274 in Phoenix, Arizona, where another moment happens at a press conference. But this time, this is a lot less funny and feels a lot more real.
You've always fought anybody, of course, but is it a little more exciting to fight the guy with Dana White privilege, right? I mean, you nailed it with him.
I don't think that shit's very funny.
No?
You do, maybe.
I thought that the moniker was good. I thought it was pretty enjoyable.
I don't think it's very funny. So, I mean, everybody's looking at it and they're smiling, they're laughing at it, but nobody's saying shit. So, I'm the kid that's up here with Dana Brown privilege, I guess, or whatever the fuck you want to call it. I don't think it's very funny anymore. And neither do you guys. I don't think you guys should think that's very funny. So I'm taking this weekend very fucking seriously. So I'll kick this Dana White boy's ass.
Ever since that moment, that Dana White privilege line has felt a lot less funny and way more insidious to me. On Monday, January 2nd, 2023, footage from Mexico shows a series of contentious interactions between Dana and his wife Anne, resulting in Dana White slapping his wife after she slapped him at a party. Now, I'm not going to show you the footage, but the footage is quite easily able to be found all over the internet. As the story started making waves around the internet, the injury to Damar Hamlin during the Cincinnati Bengals and Buffalo Bills Monday Night Football game began to overtake the news cycle. For the first couple of days, the main reaction to this situation was primarily in the MMA space. It really didn't even crack the national media. But over the next coming days, more and more outside media outlets who wouldn't normally focus on MMA started to pick up the story. Now, during the initial push of the story, the people who were the first to break it was, of course, TMZ, who actually had an entire statement and an actual interview with Dana White when the news dropped. And Dana White, to his credit, actually owned up to the situation and was given a lot of, frankly, just softball questions by TMZ and didn't take any of them. They said, oh, there's alcohol. Oh, you and your wife and this. And he immediately said, I have to own up to this. He referred to his statement back in 2014 about how you don't come back from hitting a woman and that he really needed to assess things. And it was strange that in a situation where the guy who hits his wife looked the best and this would continue to be a trend that would just get worse and worse. Now, I expected the weird online trolls and all the misogynists to get back up on Dana White's horse and say, well, equal rights, equal fights, and all that bullshit and whatever. And I expected that, but I wasn't really expecting an entire media infrastructure to help and protect this man, because I've seen in previous instances of domestic violence in sports, and not even that, just anything controversial in sports, when an athlete is caught up in it, there's a swift and immediate need for people in the media to want to pass judgment and to criticize that person, whether it's rightful or not. And it was just strange that someone in the highest positions of power was not only really not being criticized, but was essentially being assisted in his efforts to make himself not look as bad. And it made me just really want to explore why we're doing this and why we're giving this pass. And it came to me, it's because of Dana White privilege. It's something that would never be afforded to an athlete. We have our societal biases of where athletes are in the world and how they contribute to the business. Even though they're the most essential part, they're essentially the lowest part of the class. So this idea just kept on burning in my mind. So I just wanted to try to better explain it to you guys, to show you that this isn't really a Dana White problem. This is a capitalism around the world problem. This is not just in the US. This occurs with sports teams owners across the world, or high executives in positions around the world. You obviously don't need me to tell you that, but this essay is basically looking at why this occurs and what we can do about it, maybe? I don't know. Let's explore. Now, a brief disclaimer before we actually get into the thesis of this all. Obviously, I do not condone domestic violence, whether that be a man hitting a woman hitting a man. I feel like in the situation that we saw on camera, Dana White was being the aggressor in that situation, at least from my perspective. He was in her personal space, grabbing onto her arm. That could make you feel threatened. And people say online, like, oh, well, she hit him first, so he could hit her back. And while I am in agreement that, yes, Dana White's wife shouldn't have hit him, I feel like in that situation, she was feeling threatened. I mean, Dana White is at least a half a foot taller than her. I would imagine anywhere from 60 to 70 pounds bigger than her. And ask yourself, if you were in that situation, if someone was in your personal space grabbing onto you who was a half a foot taller than you and bigger than you, would you feel like you might need to defend yourself in that situation? I'm saying I'm not condoning what she did, but I can understand her situation more than I can understand Dana White's response by hitting her at least once, confirmed, and then what potentially looks like going in for another hit, or at least grabbing her again. And that's just not something I would ever condone. He was not in a situation where his life was being threatened, like he was going to be killed or anything like that. It was an open hand slap. He could have just walked away. He's a grown ass man. He's got 2 feet that were fine to go in and try to hit her. He could have gone and turned around and walked away, and this would not have been an issue. But he made an awful choice, and yes, he did own up to it, but it was an awful choice that he didn't need to make. That's what I just need to get across. It's sad in this day and age that I have to put all this out there, but now that I got it out there, let's get into the thesis. Now, my thesis is that while domestic violence might occur amongst both athletes and management in sports, we disproportionately are likely to punish athletes because of societal and class biases, the media's manipulation, and our perceived value of who means more to the business, athletes versus the executives and the owners. So we got that all together. All right, let's explore the first part of this with the societal class biases. If you look up the definition of class bias in the Collins Dictionary, you'll get this. Noun, prejudicial treatment or perception based on social class. Often in sports, people don't really see class when it comes to people like athletes and owners because oftentimes they see the salaries or the payouts that some of these athletes make, and it's like, well, it's a lot more than I ever make, so they're clearly in a different status than I am. And while that might be true in a sense, that athlete's position is far more fragile than most people realize. And especially when you compare that athlete's economic status to an owner or an executive, most likely, where an athlete's maintaining their career is relying on their athletic ability and physical ability, which obviously has limits. Most of the times for executives and people in higher power positions, that doesn't apply. They can be in the business for years and years, far beyond their usefulness, and their physical abilities don't really have to apply to anything. As long as they're alive, in some cases, they can just keep on doing whatever they want. Let me just give you a few examples about how, and particularly with domestic violence, we usually have a firm and pretty quick reaction to punish athletes, but when it comes to punishing executives and sports owners, we're not as consistent in that. In 2012, for example, Floyd Mayweather was sentenced to 90 days in jail for domestic violence charges. In 2014, you have the whole Ray Rice situation where he was caught hitting his fiance, now wife, on camera, and he was initially not punished really at all. He had got like 3 games, and then it became an indefinite punishment, and his career was over from that point. And you also have the same thing in 2015 with Greg Hardy in the NFL, where he essentially was suspended for 10 games. And it essentially had a huge effect on his career in football, but he was able to transition into mixed martial arts and ironically join the UFC, which isn't very surprising. And actually, on the card he first appeared on, he appeared on the same card as Rachel Ostovich, who just a few weeks prior to that card was a victim of domestic violence. So kind of just shows you how tone deaf UFC, MMA, and kind of combat sports are to people who are involved in domestic violence, whether they be alleged perpetrators or victims. Just looking at the UFC in 2010, we have Tito Ortiz, who was arrested and charged with domestic violence after allegedly assaulting his girlfriend. He faced legal consequences and was suspended by the UFC, but was also allowed to fight professionally and continue his career afterwards. You also have the case of Thiago Silva in 2014, where the UFC, after he was arrested and charged with domestic assault, got rid of him. And it also occurred with Josh Grisby in 2015. He was released. But you can even see in those cases, depending on how much that person matters, really dependent on if they were going to stay with the company. Obviously, a Tito Ortiz is a lot more famous than a Thiago Silva or a Josh Grisby. So even if domestic violence did occur in those same situations, the UFC saw more of a reason to keep Tito Ortiz around than those other guys. Now, that's honestly a little bit of speculation on my part, but you can kind of see this similar trend when it comes to executives and management when it comes to sports as well. Recently, Chris Albrecht had to step down from his position at Legendary because of previous domestic assault allegations that came up from a book about his time working at HBO. You have another example of an executive who was a part of the Houston Astros who was talking about a player who was alleged involved in a domestic violence incident, and he was essentially praising him, and he was also removed because of those actions. But those tend to be people who are, even themselves, while they might be in powerful executive positions, they still aren't the top of the top. There have been multiple incidents amongst the Dallas Mavericks management staff where members of the executive team were involved in situations of both sexual harassment and even sometimes physical abuse of staff. And essentially, Mark Cuban had this happen all under his watch, and he was only fined a few $1 million for that. And I'm saying a few $1 million like that's not a lot of money. Well, it isn't a lot of money to Mark Cuban, but nobody was saying that he needed to step down from ownership or anything like that, even though there were multiple situations where a hostile environment was forming, especially to female employees and just employees who were against that type of behavior. And an even more disturbing case, you have Lamar Hunt Jr. Back in May of 2000, Lamar Hunt Jr., who is the son of Lamar Hunt Sr., who is the original founders of the Chiefs, he actually was in a lawsuit that he settled where he was accused of essaying his mentally disabled sister-in-law, and I believe it was a payment of $2 million he ended up giving her. I know in the early 2000s, a much different political and social climate than we have today, but still, even in this case, there were very few stories about how he needed to step down and needed to be removed from his position. He's actually still in the Chiefs ownership, and he's still their team president today. So that's a thing. For this next section, we're looking at the role of media manipulation. If you look at the definition of media manipulation from simplical.com, it is the use of communication media to deceive or mislead. This is often done for the purposes of propaganda, activism, financial gain, and public relations. And I think this is actually really key when you focus on those last two of financial gain and public relations, particularly the public relations part of it. We've been seeing just a lot of takes that are quite unusual when it comes to this type of situation. There's a Kevin Iole article, and if you know anything about Kevin Iole, he is a big fanboy of Dana White, and this article he put out at Yahoo is just wow. There are a lot of takes, and I'm just gonna put them on the screen here just so you can look at them and be a judge for yourself of how you feel about it. But I don't think Kevin Iole would be so willing to be forgiving if Dana White was one of the fighters on the UFC who was accused of domestic assault, instead of being one of the faces of the company and one of the top executives of it. And when it comes to ESPN, oh my God, just the utter and deafening silence. And not only that, but we're seeing basically their own staff that they're being told that they can't really even comment about this situation. I don't think there's anybody in sports that the ESPN would be doing this for. I don't think they would be doing this for a Roger Goodell if he was in this situation, or an Adam Silver. But because Dana White and the UFC are probably even more ingrained into the ESPN business model than even sport like the NFL or NBA in some ways, there's definitely a real public relations aspect where it looks like they are just trying to figure out at this time what they're going to do about it. And I honestly think they're just hoping it goes away. And the way they're going to do that is by not talking about it. And when they do talk about it, it's in situations like with Stephen A. Smith, where they refer to Dana White as a friend and try to make him look as good as possible and have very, very little critical analysis about what's going on. It really just seems like hey guys, let's not talk about this. We have fights next week and let's focus on that instead. Now, this last part of this essay is going over the idea of perceived business value pertaining to, in this case, the athletes versus the owners and executives. Now, if you look up the definition of perceived value, I'm going to be using the one from the businessprofessor.com. Perceived value refers to a customer's opinion or evaluation of a product or service. The evaluation is based on how the goods or service met the needs and expectations of the customer and its cost relative to other similar goods. Now, there's a lot of interesting ideas about a worth of an athlete, especially when we compare it to the worth of other jobs that we have in our society. And a lot of the times people look at athletes and kind of see them as just like rich millionaires that are just like completely out of touch with society. And that's true in some cases, but not in a lot of them, and especially not in the case of UFC fighters, which have had historical issues with pay. That's an issue that is way too big even for this essay to go over. That might be a separate video, but anyway, there's a book called $40 Million Slaves, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of the Black Athlete by William C. Roden, which goes over this idea, especially when it comes through the intersection of race and class, but a lot of those ideas can also be applied to athletes generally, whether they be black, white, or whatever. They are still being exploited in ways that are kind of eye-opening if you really think about it, but a lot of the time people don't want to, I really feel like, think about, because it then makes them feel complicit in a part of the problem. But anyway, when it comes to the perceived business value, athletes are typically seen as, while essential part of the business is, also quite replaceable. I mean, especially if you look in the case of a UFC fighter, some of these fighters are getting paid 10 and 10 contracts, which, if you're not aware, 10 and 10 means that you get paid $10,000 to show up to fight, and then you have $10,000 if you win the fight. And while many people think that would be great for one night, they don't consider all of the additional management fees that are then taken away. If you have a percentage that goes to your nutritionist, to the gym that you're a part of, and also taxes. And then all of a sudden, once you take all those things into consideration, the athlete doesn't have a lot of money to go home with, and they're often just struggling to get from fight camp to fight camp. And you hear of just these terrible stories of how athletes are barely able to eat the proper food they need to train, to house themselves. And this isn't just occurring amongst the lower ranks of the UFC. This is even occurring fighters who are in the top 10 of their divisions. Bryce Mitchell recently was talking about how he needed to fight on this previous card of December 2022 just so he could have more than a couple $1,000 going into his pocket for the next couple of months. So if he's feeling it, this is definitely being felt far further down the ladder than he is. But when it comes to the perceived business value of someone like Dana White, it couldn't be any more different. Just look at the fact of when the UFC was bought for $4.2 billion in 2016, which was at the time the largest sports transaction in history. One of the key pieces in that transaction was Dana White needed to stay on and be a part of the company. You could look at someone like Mark Shapiro, the president of Endeavor, who, when referring to the UFC as a part of their business strategy in 2020 during the pandemic, he said himself, the UFC was our saving grace. The CEO of Endeavor, Ari Emanuel, even said himself, the UFC without audiences, which is a big player for us, and commercial pay-per-view beat our numbers by 10%. So we are, I think, the best position for where the world is going. They see the UFC as a huge part of their business in the future. They want to do everything possible to make sure that it goes along without a hitch. And they perceive that if Dana White were not a part of the UFC, not only would it affect the value of their stock prices, but the UFC wouldn't be able to function as well as maybe they believe it has in the past or it does currently, which I honestly don't think is the case. In my honest opinion, I feel like even if Dana were to step down, which I don't necessarily think will happen or should happen, he's not necessarily the most important thing. The business kind of goes along with or without him. He's kind of there largely as a ceremonial role. There are other people who do his functions, maybe not his promotion functions, but honestly, the UFC has been pretty garbage with their promotion in the past few years, so it's not like he's doing a great job at that. So maybe they could use someone different, but that's just my casual ass opinion. And obviously people who are as powerful as like Ari Emanuel really don't give a fuck what I think. So they see Dana as an essential part of the business, and they'll do anything in their power to make sure that he stays there. So in conclusion, it's about 1 a.m. on January 9th right now. And I don't think anything's going to happen to Dana, unfortunately. Would I wish maybe there's some type of at least action towards not only just accepting responsibility, but using this as potentially a teaching tool where not only maybe could he step away from his position for a while to show that this is a serious situation, but also being able to put financial tools to help empower those who've suffered from domestic violence, or making a statement during something like the Super Bowl talking about issues with domestic violences and resources people can use if they feel like they're in situations where they're in the potential danger of domestic violence. But I don't think that's going to happen. It's just not what we as a society really want from people in power. We often give them a pass if they give us something that we like. Some of us will religiously fight for those people, even though those people really wouldn't fight for us. And it's kind of upsetting. I hope something happens. If there's an update, I'll definitely do that. I know this was kind of all of a rant, but this was just something I feel like that I needed to get off my chest, because it's just something that I've been thinking about. I've been seeing just some awful takes, but also a lot of positive ones. You can look at Ariel Helwani's response, Luke Thomas's response to this are all really good examples about how you should actually be taking on this situation in a responsible and thoughtful manner. But I hope that this just gave you a little clarification in case you were wondering why there hasn't been the type of action that maybe you expected. This is the reason why. And I hope, honestly, we could just find a better solution to better solve these issues. Use people's examples like Dana White's, where maybe we can use it as a teaching tool to show that this is not okay, and try to reach out to those people who might be potentially be in those situations. But I'm just not sure that we're gonna really get anything of value from it. Yeah, hope you guys been doing great. Trying this YouTube thing, like and subscribe. Probably gonna do hopefully more positive MMA videos, but 2023 hasn't been that positive so far. Hopefully things get better as fights start coming these next few weeks. Anyway, hope you guys are doing well. Comment on things you want to see in the future. I'm going to bed.
This is not the world that I live in, where there's repercussions and punishment.
It's what you said, Ariel. Like I mean, even someone of your stature, if this happened to them, you're fired from every outlet that you work with. Like, if anyone normal this happens at their workplace. I mean, they're fired without question, and they'll have to answer for it for every single job interview they go to afterward. Obviously, he's in a different category.